Hello and a very warm welcome to you all. I'm Hannes McNulty, Green Industry Advisor at the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, and I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar, Preparing Green Investment Projects, What Works and What Doesn't. This is our second webinar of the year, and we're really delighted to be collaborating with the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development, the DCED, which brings together governmental, philanthropic, and multilateral agencies working on private sector development, seeking to enhance cross-agency collaboration and to share knowledge. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take a short moment to introduce the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, or GGKP as it is better known. We are a global network of experts and organizations dedicated to providing the policy, business, and finance communities with everything from knowledge, guidance, data, and tools to transition to an inclusive green economy. If you aren't already familiar with the GGKP, I would encourage you to visit any of our 3 knowledge platforms most relevant to your interests. We have the policy-focused Green Growth Knowledge Platform, the Green Finance Platform, and also the Green Industry Platform. It would also be appreciated if you could consider signing up to our newsletter at ggkp.org/subscribe. I'm also very excited to announce that this year, the GGKP is launching the Green Forum, an online community space for sharing and discussing insights on a range of themes and issues related to sustainable economic transformation. And the Green Forum will actually soon be hosting a dedicated community space focused on green investing, so do stay tuned on this. Back to today's webinar. We are very fortunate to be joined by thought leaders from the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Internationale Zusammenarbeit, or in English, the German Development Agency, GIZ, the International Finance Corporation, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom, and Munyax Eco, a Rwandan-Belgian company reconciling business and clean environment. We are encouraging audience members to submit questions and comments throughout today's discussion. It really is a fantastic opportunity for you to be able to engage directly with the panel of experts. And after the webinar, we'd appreciate it if you could take just a couple of minutes to complete our short survey, as your feedback will really be a big help to us in shaping future webinars. Please also note that today's presentations, as well as a full recording of the webinar, will be available on our website at ggkp.org. Finally, I would also like to welcome you to join next week's webinar, Material Efficiency Strategies for Business, Untapped Climate Solutions for Buildings and Mobility, which is organized jointly with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the International Resource Panel, the World Economic Forum, and the United Nations Environment Programme. The week after that, don't miss another webinar organized again jointly with the DCED, a guide to designing high-performing eco-industrial parks for donors, governments, and park managers. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's event, Ghita, a Morocco country officer at the International Finance Corporation. Ghita is a climate finance expert with 11 years experience working with the United Nations and financial institutions. At the United Nations Environment Programme, Ghita worked as a program officer in the Energy Finance Unit, working with project developers, governments, commercial and development banks to develop institutional capacity, establish public-private partnerships, and design climate-related projects and strategies for the uptake of renewable energy and energy efficiency for the Mediterranean region and sub-Saharan Africa. So without further ado, Ghita, I'm really delighted to welcome you to today's webinar and hereby turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannes, and thank you everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar to discuss the important and crucial role of the topic of preparing green investment projects. It's indeed a topic that is very, very dear to my heart, as Hannes mentioned, as I manage 2 project preparation facilities, and I witnessed several project developers struggling for years before bringing their project from idea to bankability stage. And one of the primary challenges slowing down the development of green projects, and this is particularly the case of renewable energy projects, since we will be welcoming our last panelist in this sector, is the early stage financing gap. So during the early stage of development of project, which goes from the idea stage to the bankability stage, projects carry significant risk. And this risk is only mitigated when all the permits have been secured and all the legal, operational, and financial viability has been demonstrated. While the costs of early stage development are comparatively low because they concern mainly studies, the risk and barrier for investors and developers are extremely high. In developing countries, you must know, only 1 in every 4 projects reaches financial close in the absence of support. Which means a success rate of 25%. While you will often hear financiers claiming that finance is not the problem, but we lack a good pipeline of investable projects, you will hear, on the other hand, project developers claiming that they have the project idea, but they lack the finance to develop it and implement it. These questions are becoming even more pressing, as the IPCC estimates that the investment required to achieve the low carbon transition range from 1.6 billion to 1.6 trillion to 3.8 trillion annually. And though the climate finance has surged over the past years with 546 billion for 28, we are far from reaching this goal. To address this topic, we are very lucky to have today around the table representatives from the donor community, a representative from project preparation facility, and the project developer to take stock of what works and what does not to move projects from ideas to actual megawatts. So during the discussion, we will shed the light on the challenges that face project developers during the project development and preparation of green projects. We will also discuss how to address this early stage financing gap and also the gaps that exist during the development of the project through the role of a public-private partnership and project preparation facilities. We will start our session with a 10-minute presentation from each of our panelists. And we aim to have a very interactive session. So please, if you do have questions, please write them in the chat box. And also we will have a 5-minute Q&A after each presentation. So you will get the chance to ask your question. And at the end, we will have a 40-minute Q&A from the audience. So first, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mike Reddaway. Mike is a private sector advisor in the Climate and Environment Division at FCDO in the UK, where he oversees the Climate Public-Private Partnership, which is known as CP3. And I know Mike from a previous life, as I used to manage a project under the CP3 program, so I'm very pleased to welcome you. And I must admit that the UK is one of the most sophisticated donors when it comes to approaches around project additionality and maximizing the impact of public financing. So without further undue delays, I will let Mike touch base on these 2 aspects. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ghita. Appreciated. So, as has been said, my name is Mike Reddaway. I'm a policy manager at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and I've been managing one of our flagship climate interventions for the last 3 years, the Climate Public-Private Partnership, or CP3. Next slide, please. So I've been asked to share with you some of the lessons that we have generated through CP3. So I'm going to introduce the programme and describe what it was intended to do, then explain what went right, what went wrong with the execution, and finally talk about what we have learned from this experience to some of you today. So moving on to the next slide. What is CP3? CP3 is a £130 million joint initiative from the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And it's funded through the UK's International Climate Finance. CP3 was created because the UK government realised that public funds by themselves weren't going to be enough to meet the climate challenge in developing countries, and that as such investment from the private sector was going to need to be mobilised and at scale. So in order to achieve this scale, CP3 participated as an anchor investor in 2 private equity funds. This included investing £50 million in the IFC managed Catalyst Fund and £60 million in Asia Climate Partners, which was managed by the Asia Development Bank. These investments were made on pari passu terms, and the expectation with them was that they would provide commercial returns as well as development and environmental benefits. So in addition to the private equity investments, CP3 also made £11 million available for a technical assistance facility that supports first-time fund managers. So this funding has been delivered through the Seed Capital Assistance Facility, or SCAF, and that was operated by the UNDP and Frankfurt School. And this facility basically provides returnable grants to first-time fund managers. And the original aim in supporting such an initiative was to provide a pipeline of investable opportunities for the private equity funds CP3 has supported. So moving on to the next slide, the theory of change behind this intervention was that by demonstrating that these type of investments are commercially viable as well as ethically sound, CP3 could catalyse new sources of finance, such as institutional investors, and help shift developing countries onto sustainable pathways to development. There's envisaged that this process will also help build capability and create projects that can be replicated at scale. Just going to wait for the slides to catch up slightly here. So if we could keep skipping through all the slides, please. And one more. Thank you. So what actually happened in practice? Well, it wasn't all good. Starting with what went wrong, Asia Climate Partners, one of the private equity funds that we invested in, encountered performance issues pretty much from the start. After only managed to complete 4 investments in 7 years, we regrettably reached the decision to wind it up. Some of the lessons we learned from here were pretty important, and I could talk about this subject for several hours, but in the interest of being brief, I think the main problems are basically that it had a difficult burn. It failed to reach first close. Even when it did get off the ground, this meant that the markets that it was trying to invest in had fundamentally shifted, and the original investment thesis no longer held. It took 7 years between the conception of the program to actually reaching delivery, and I think that was just too long. This fund also struggled to source and close deals, and this was both because the market had become more competitive as costs for renewable energies came down, but also because there was an adequate pipeline of investable opportunities in other areas. I think finally, the governance of the fund was overly complex, and the alignment of interest between the various investors was pretty tenuous. And as the fund became under pressure, I think those differences just became magnified. Next slide. So that's what went wrong. On the brighter side, what went right? The fund of funds we invested in, Catalyst Fund, continues to perform well in line with expectations, despite the impact of COVID-19. Our investment with them is still active, and there are now over 100 investments in the portfolio, and the co-financing it has attracted has been really impressive, as you can see from the slide. We also found that the experience of using the fund of funds model allowed us to get much greater reach and exposure than we would otherwise achieve. So next slide, please. And my favourite part of the programme is the Seed Capital Assistance Facility. Despite receiving the smallest amount of funding, it was the most successful and interesting thing that we did through this programme. We were able to support projects that covered a wide range of issues and problems that early stage projects were running into. We managed to solve reasonably well. And we also learned crucially, I think, through this process that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. The other thing we found interesting here was we found the demonstration effect actually happening. So people were seeing what developers had done in this space, and they were actively copying them and doing it in markets. Next slide, please. So based on this experience, what lessons did we learn and what ones might be relevant to you? Firstly, we found that there remains a major gap in the market for early stage finance, and that's slowing down growth and limiting investment opportunities for the CP3 funds. They often cited to us a lack of pipeline as a barrier, and for Asia climate partners in particular, it had a bit of a throttling effect on the ability of the fund to grow. Whilst we were we weren't doing enough to ensure that there's a pipeline of investable projects available to support that scale. As a result, one of the fundamental lessons we took from this experience was that you have to provide support along the whole financing chain, and that more specifically, there's a need for greater seed finance, and particularly seed finance that is available to new entrants who are likely to increase innovation and open up new markets. Secondly, we found that public sector interventions have to be targeted and specific. Where we were not directed or specific enough, we found that fund managers defaulted into easier opportunities. So as a result of that, the majority of the CP3 portfolio is invested in energy generation, and some areas are severely underfunded, such as adaptation, which only covers 5% of the portfolio. We've also reconsidered, because of that, how we think about additionality, and put simply, how do we increase the chances that we only back projects that wouldn't have happened without support anyway? And as a result of that, we now discount all our results for the program by applying an additionality modifier. And this basically removes or discounts portions of the results dependent on how well developed the market we invested in was. So for somewhere quote unquote hard, like Sierra Leone, we'll count all the results, but for somewhere like China, we won't count any of them. I think we also discovered the need to be patient. So project development is a financial and human resource intensive industry, and the allocation of both these resources requires extensive planning and investment. So as such, support provided to new entrants needs to be highly concessional, and funders need to be prepared to give them time. So final slide, please. What conclusions can we draw from our experience here of providing financing to green investment projects? So firstly, FCDO as a donor prioritises additionality and high impact. We don't want to be doing things that other people want to do, or that the private sector can do on their own. And these are risky and challenging things to achieve, and they can frequently be at odds with the aims of private investors who are usually prioritising commercial returns. So for partnerships between these two to really be successful, that tension needs to be really carefully managed. And to ensure that's managed well, there needs to be a really strong alignment of interest between delivery partners. And there's not, I'd say, our conclusion from this was that there's nothing really in this program that wouldn't have been fixable if there was greater alignment between the delivery partners and the investors. I think next, I would say that the public sector lacks the agility required to respond to rapidly changing markets, and therefore interventions should be as adaptable and flexible as possible and able to respond to changes in the external environment. We found the private equity funds that we supported did achieve scale, but they were slow to respond to new challenges and opportunities. Conversely, SCAF was much more efficient at pivoting towards emerging trends. So I think in order to drive investment in emerging markets, there's also a need for specialist programs that incentivize people to do the difficult things and be the first movers. That also involves a high tolerance for risk while supporting bespoke approaches to challenging problems. And I think finally, there still remains a really big gap for early stage financing. But as we focus on the billions to trillions agenda, we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of supporting the whole financing chain. So I think that's just about my time up there. I'll leave you with one final thought, that one of the really big benefits we've got from this program is the learning that it's generated, and we appreciate the opportunity to be able to share it with other like-minded actors in this space. So thank you very much for your time today. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mike. So maybe if the audience have specific questions from Mike, we'll leave like maybe a minute to the audience to react. Otherwise, we will move to our second speaker. Maybe I'll take only one question here that is relevant to Mark. Do you know if there's early stage fund for local decentralized low carbon infrastructure schemes? I think you have already mentioned SCAF, but maybe there are other programs from the UK that you would like to highlight.
Yeah, so I think SCAF is potentially a relevant program to look at here, and I'm happy to pass on any details to you on that bilaterally and have a conversation about that offline. I think depending on the kind of scale you're talking about, with this early stage, SCAF is probably the most relevant. We also have some other programs that are run by one of our partner departments, BASE, which might be of interest. But I'm happy to pass those details on to you if you can give me some further details on what the specifics of the project are.
Great. So maybe we can move to our second speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Michael Franz. Michael is the team leader of Get.Invest, a very famous program, a program that aims at mobilizing investments in energy programs and companies. So Michael will be telling us more about his program and how they help projects matching financing her expectation and how they help mobilize financing for projects. The floor is yours.
Exactly. Thank you very much. And this is actually a really good sequence. Rita, you have outlined the problem, and also Mike, you alluded to it, that Get.Invest was set up to address. You can go to the next slide, please. I have been working in the space now for almost 14 or 15 years, in fact, and things have changed. Let's put it this way. In all those years, most of it for the better. The lessons that I'm presenting are phrased mostly in a positive tone. Conversely, if you turn it around, then that would be how not to do it. I would like to argue, at least. And it draws a little bit beyond the experience that we have with Get.Invest alone, also what I've picked up over those years. But at Get.Invest, indeed, the idea is that we are a tool that focuses on a specific need, i.e. to link project developers and companies with finance to help bridge that gap. We are a European program. We are funded by the European Union and by 4 member states. That's Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Austria. And we're implemented by GIZ. So at the heart, we are a project and company, I should say, preparation facility. We have in the green circle on this slide, you can see how we have structured our support offering for companies. You can cut this cake in different ways. Essentially, what this means is that as a company or as a project, one can come to us, ask for help. This is us, and present with a proper presentation and application. We can then link with many of the different funding sources that are available. Around this, we have built an ecosystem of partnerships and support services that mostly aim at getting the word out there and mobilize applicants for our services, because we are 100% demand driven. I cannot go to somebody and say, I would like to support you. The companies would have to come to us. You can go to the next slide, please. You can peruse this at your convenience, and of course, we can also talk bilaterally. Fortunately, thanks to the support by the donors and also the good partnerships and the experts that we have in the team, the wider team, I should say, we have been having quite a bit of traction. This is numbers from the last 4 years of the facility. And in this funnel that you see on the right slide, there's also directly one of the main lessons. We have had, by now it's more than 700 applications in 4 years, and of which we have worked with 170-ish companies, of which we right now have about 100 in the pipeline, of which we have linked more than 50 now with financiers, of which 15 are actually in financial close. That's a brutal reality of private sector doing business. I should mention that we cut across and we support many different business models. We have on-grid, we have commercial and industrial, we have off-grid electricity, and also clean cooking in the portfolio. So it's a big diversity. On the left side, and that has a message in it itself as well, that's the landscape of financiers that we interact with, that we find in the market. It's an enormous complexity, and it's very difficult for many companies and project developers to navigate this, and that's partly what we're helping with. I should say that these are the ones that we're interacting with, meaning normally, and that's another reality, a project or a company has different source of finance, and they all need to fit together. Moving on to the next slide and coming to what we've learned. I would like to talk a little bit about what we see in the market happening out there, because it's important to keep that in mind, because that is what we essentially need to work with and address and interface with. Sounds maybe obvious, but energy systems in developing countries are different from what we use elsewhere. I would like to argue we have a and I would think right now also accelerating paradigm shift from centralized to decentralized solutions. I believe the energy systems in partner countries, in particular in Sub-Saharan Africa, where mostly my experience lies, are and will be different in the future from what we're used to in Europe. There's a much greater diversity of needs and solutions. There are different subsectors into which the landscape falls, and they have often very little in common. The cooking problem is not right now and in the foreseeable future something that can be solved with grid-based electricity, for example. What we see is, especially in the last year, that the big projects move slowly and take a long time to develop, and that smaller or medium-sized private sector SME approaches, we have Francine here, are much more agile. And in the COVID year, we have seen also that these companies are more resilient. Our pipeline on projects right now is not moving very much, and we see it across the market. That has many different aspects to it, but that should be kept in mind also with a view to some of the future crises that we're facing when we're talking about resilience. The mismatch between finance, on the one hand, financiers and projects companies, what I mean with this is that it's often a very different perspective to do business or to want to provide finance and invest, and people don't speak the same language. And that's partly why it needs a facility such as ours. Moving on to the next slide, please. A couple of insights what we have learned on the finance side. Still, and Mike and Ghita referred to this, the finance that we have in development finance mostly is still traditionally mostly geared towards traditional power sector projects. If you are a late stage, large scale, relatively mature power project, then it's going to be not that difficult to find finance. If you are more innovative, relatively small or early stage, it is very difficult. And if you are a domestic entrepreneur, local entrepreneur, it's even more difficult, controversially so, but that is the reality that we observe. And accessing capital and navigating the different modalities can be arcanely complex from the perspective of a developer. But, and that's one of the things that has really changed in the last couple of years, there's a lot of financiers, specific dedicated instruments, actors out there that have emerged that are really trying to plug this gap. Still, I would like to argue that from a policymaker perspective, finance is still often seen as the silver bullet. We just need to deploy more and allocate more funding, and then things are somehow going to fall into place. It's not like that. I would like to argue that with an enabling environment, it's possible to start doing business and then you can be financed. Of course, you need to know that the finance is there, or that you can tap into a guarantee that will incentivize you and make life easier. But if the fundamentals aren't in place, and if you don't manage to develop a viable business or project, it's not going to happen. And that is, yeah, one point that I really would like to bring across. I will answer these questions later. Very interesting questions in the chat, but I would like to ask us to move to the next slide, please, because these are some of the lessons that we have learned as a facility that works in that space. So how can you be successful as a project preparation facility? You need to keep it simple. You need to have a clear added value and messaging, because companies need to come to us. If we would go and pick the companies, we would probably end up distorting competition, and that would not be a good thing. So it has to be a level playing field for anybody, and keep the bureaucracy at a minimum. I have made mistakes in my years when I thought that a certain technology is a fantastic idea. From my perspective, sitting here in Brussels, I have been working in the field still, but we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't try to push certain technologies in the market within reason, that should be said. The point here is to stay flexible and respond to the demand. Let the market come to you. Another point is a lot of solutions, they look quite nice on PowerPoint, but then in reality, to actually pull it off is not that easy. Some of the support facilities out there or funding instruments are too complex and unnecessarily so, or try to solve too many things at the same time. And that is probably not going to work. In addition, you really need not only a good presentation, the architecture. If you have 700 clients coming your way, many of you will be running a business. You know what that means. You need to have the proper system in place to handle all this. And that is easily overlooked. And then you end up with complicated application procedures or slow response times and things like that. Last but not least, there is a fashion, especially in terms of digitalization, to look at platforms, put an online platform, an online marketplace, and everything is going to happen by itself. No, it's not like that. It's people's business. There's people developing projects and companies. There's people deciding whether the finance is going to be deployed or not. And there's also people that are providing the advice. And that's really what matters. If we provide advice, we need to have the right people with the right skill set to provide that advice. That's a really important point. If we could move on to my last slide, please. I would like to conclude with 3 takeaways, if I may, for those among the audience that are working in the policy space. I'm a political scientist by training at some point a long time ago. I understand how politics work and that there is a need to have a certain turnover and new announcements in terms of new initiatives. But that makes it hard for the market and also for those that provide support, because it takes time to get things going. Project and business development does take time. From early stage to late stage to financing to operations in types of projects, or from getting in the market, Series A fundraising, Series B, and growing for companies. We should try to further simplify and not further complicate the landscape of support instruments. And I would like to argue that this is particularly difficult as we have now cross-cutting issues that are coming in. And I do observe a certain tendency to reinvent the wheel. I think some coordination work should take place between the climate and the energy spaces, for example. I see that in my real life, and that could make it, work could be done that would make it easier for market participants here, basically, or keep it easy. And then, yes, things are happening quickly. Mike, you referred to this, the fundamentals change while the instruments are in place or while priorities change. And we need to build that flexibility in and leave that flexibility to the support and to the financing instruments. Voila. I have also used up my time. I would like to thank you very much for listening in. Do feel free to go to our website, check us out. We're in business. If you're a company, if you're a project developer, small advertisement, we would like to support you, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you very much for your presentation. Maybe I will start with a very easy question from the audience. What's the difference between a small and big scale project? Maybe it's maybe for us it's obvious, but it's maybe good to explain that to the audience.
No, it's not
and maybe what are like the main difference that you would see, the way you assist like maybe a small projects versus a bigger project.
Big projects are more than 40 million transaction size infrastructure, power generation, transmission, distribution projects, for which there are many available sources of funding. If you go below that, let alone if you go below 10 million euros or even below 1 million euro, the further you go down, the more difficult it gets. And I understand why that is so. It's the transaction cost matter. But there is value also in small approaches, decentralized approaches, because they often tend to be associated with higher development impacts, local job creation, and so on and so forth. But there is no hard line between small and big. What we do observe, however, is that there's a big difference whether it's a project or whether it's a company. Yeah, if it's project finance, there's a certain way how that is done. That's relatively straightforward. If it's corporate finance, it's completely different. If SME finance, if you're trying to mobilize funding for somebody who wants to sell tens of thousands of solar home systems kits, for example, completely different story than somebody who wants to install 6 or 60 megawatts of solar power. 6 would be small, 60 would be relatively big, but then of course in an international context, even that nowadays is small. If it is a small project, normally, and that is, I'm saying this neutrally, with great appreciation for the different skill set, the likelihood that you have people that are exposed to the world of international and formal finance, that can understand the contracts, do the financial models, speak the language of financiers, is less high. That means you need to provide that kind of support more. Yeah, and that is the main difference I would like to argue between the larger and the bigger, or the more or the less internationally exposed actors. What I think, it is possible to, of course, target facilities to certain target groups, but what I like to argue is that one should be open to the different needs and have the right competence, cut the cake that way. You know, that's what we have done. We focused on one particular group of needs, i.e., anything that a company or project needs to go from I have something that looks good and feels good to I have been financed, and advise them accordingly.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. And this makes like the perfect transition for our third and final panelist, Francine, who will be talking about small-scale projects. So Francine Munyaneza is the founder and CEO of Munyax Eco company, specialized in solar energy, as well as La Maison Verte, green ecological green building project. So Francine will be talking about what she refers to as an obstacle course to develop projects and access funding. Francine, the floor is yours.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to give me the opportunity to talk about briefly the good side and the challenges that we are facing during our long path of creating business and doing business here in Africa and in Rwanda in particular. First of all, just to explain a little bit the story of my business very briefly. Munyax Eco, it's a company that I created a few years ago, 6 years ago exactly. Before that, I was in the humanitarian sector. I love my job, but I wanted to do something a little bit different, knowing the challenges that we are facing of accessing energy in Africa, and also knowing that our skills as diaspora, I was member of diaspora, are sometimes very needed in Africa, and particularly in Rwanda. And that's how I came back, creating my company and also having a project of green building, La Maison Verte, as you mentioned, Ghita. Next slide, please. Yes, knowing that when I took the decision to come, I was also lucky, because in Rwanda, in terms of energy, access to energy, and in terms of private enterprises, it's a good context to start a company, knowing the policy, the advantages linked to private sector. We were able to create our company very rapidly, and also to take advantage of the possibilities and the policy which is made in Rwanda regarding rural access to energy, which with a target of electrifying the country by 2024, 100% electrification of the country by 2024. So it was a really good opportunity compared to some other countries. Next slide, please. Yes, so then we created a company. We had some activities starting from scratch, building activities linked to installation of solar water heaters, installation of photovoltaic system, project also soon on solar home system and mini grid. And we had the possibility, despite many challenges, to set up our activity and to do some project in Rwanda, Burundi, and even part of Congo, east of Congo. Next slide, please. We had, with the next slide, you can see that we have a social impact, despite the fact that it's a very, the energy sector is very male dominated. We made effort proactively to try to see how we can promote women inside our enterprises, recruiting them and also training them, and also targeting also women with our system, our project of electrification. Giving also the job not only to women but of course to men. We are not against men, of course, but also giving to youth, and also having an impact in terms of carbon reduction, and of course clean energy. As you know, solar energy, it's clean energy. Next slide, please. And then we come to the main subject, which is what about finance and support in terms of finance. First of all, when we started the company, of course, I was someone that people didn't know, and no experience also, to tell you the truth, in the sector, just the passion to work in solar energy. And we started with our savings, first of all, and then the savings became not sufficient. And also as we were increasing our activity, it was very important to get additional fundings. We tried to find fundings in local banks, local institutions, and again, this is a really long pathway. It's very challenging, and it's kind of obstacle courses. And maybe much more in our countries where green energy is something still new. It's something still not known by a lot of people, and also it's a sector where you have also a lot of foreigners coming to help us doing business, but also with the good side of developing the country. But the weak side is to see that they get funds in a very good condition that we cannot get in our country. We can get funds very difficultly, but conditions are more difficult. The fees are higher, the interest are higher, and also collateral are the banks and institutions are very exigent in terms of collaterals, because of different reasons that we will not enter here, most probably a justified reason, but it makes the life more difficult for us. And we tried to apply for local funds. We could not. Finally, we were obliged to sell our house. I sold my house, and I was happy to sell it because it could make my company continue. And then we say, okay, let's see how we can go further and see how we can find money internationally. And that's where there is the big challenge. And we applied for different organizations, including Get.Invest with Michael. And we were happy to be admitted to Get.Invest, and this system, this institution, give us a support to get money. They don't give us money, they give support to get money. So it's still a real challenge, because whoever you are, the Get.Invest or PFAN or other organizations who are on the market, most of the time they are far. Even if we work very well with them, Get.Invest, I had 2 advisors who are wonderful. We work together very well. I get a lot of advice, a lot of support. They were very dedicated, and I take the opportunity to thank them here because they really do a very nice job. The challenge is that, as we say in French, I will translate in English, even the most beautiful woman of the world cannot give what she doesn't have. So what is missing? That's the challenge. What is missing? In fact, the fact is that Get.Invest is very far. One lives in Denmark, another one in Italy, and some others all over the world. And I'm in Rwanda. So the fact to be remote, not only Get.Invest, but even when I apply for other organizations, it's difficult to communicate. They don't know you. You need to take time to make trust, confidence. You have also the fact that they are remote. It's geographic remoteness, and also the movement linked to cultural thinking. Also, Michael was mentioning also the language of the finance people. We are not used to that. So even if we have the support of Get.Invest, it's still a challenge, because Get.Invest will not do the work for you. They will support you. They will coach you. So you need really to have time to dedicate for that, while on the same time, you need to make your business and to get money. So it's a huge challenge. And I get, for me, it was a really huge challenge. And also, it's a long process. Michael was mentioning the bureaucracy. It's still also very bureaucratic to get, not only Get.Invest, but the finance. So it takes a long time. In meantime, you can maybe be bankrupt because you don't find money yet. So it's very long. So it will be good to simplify the process and to make shorter. But on the same time, also, when I was mentioning the fact that it's remote, one of the solutions will be to decentralize, to make the people available here, to nationalize also, to make the more nationals from different African countries available for this kind of support, because they know the context. I don't say that the others, they don't know, but they are more used to that. As I was mentioning, there are a difference of culture, of geography, the distance, also the soft skill. The soft skill is also a challenge, because even if Get.Invest or the others are supporting you, you still need to do a lot of work by yourselves. And I'm not against doing work, but we are already very busy. But not only doing work by yourself, but to have a really kind of important expertise in finance, high expertise in finance, that sometimes is available here, sometimes not. It's rare. And even when it is available, it's very expensive. And as a small enterprises, and I can see Michael agree with me, as a small enterprise, we cannot afford it at all. It's impossible to afford it. So why not to think about a way to make this expertise available, to do capacity building in some of our countries, to make this expertise permanently available, that we don't take time to make projects, because it's a very long path. Another point also that I felt is the fact that the design of the support that we get, the design of the financing, are done without it's very well done, but sometimes we don't consult the people on site, the people like us, business people, who are working and who knows what they need. So it will be good to see how we can have these people, a kind of task force, which include the people who are doing business in our countries, to really set up the design of projects for finance or for supporting in finance. I will give you an example that we have with, it's not linked to finance, but it's linked more to capacity building on the technical side. We had a project with the Rwandan Development Bank to do capacity building for mini-grid feasibility studies. And this project was initiated by ourselves, the entrepreneurs, where we discuss with BRD and Enabel, the Belgium cooperation. We knew that there was some money for capacity building, and we proposed them what to do. So, of course, there are still some challenges, but it works well, because we had even a steering committee where we follow the progress of the capacity building, where we review, we make comment, we change, and it has an impact, because we can feel that it corresponds to the need, to our need, in fact. So that's why I would encourage, if possible, to have a kind of system like this, which can be useful for all of us, without forgetting also that women in this sector, which is really male dominated, can be targeted in a better way and in a more proactive way. And I'm available to discuss more and to answer to your questions, if any, for the way we can do that, all of us together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francine, for all your insights, and you summarized pretty well the challenges, but also you provided very good idea on how your donor programs, project preparation facility could enhance and adapt to the needs of project developers. And you've also mentioned the dimension of women-led enterprise. So I will start with the first question related to that. So can you comment on the gender dimension of developing green projects? Are there already enough women involved in developing or working on green projects? If not, what can be done to strengthen the participation of women?
Yeah, in fact, there are not so many for the moment. As I mentioned, it's a male-dominated environment. And on our side, inside of Munyax Eco, we try by ourselves to see how we can promote women when we do recruitment and when we do capacity building. We did that on our small level, and we had a program. We put in place a program with USA, just to give you an example what can be done. We put in place a program to encourage women to be part of companies. Why? Because I could see that when I was hiring people, most of the time, even if I had a woman and a man, most of the time the man had more skill than the woman, because of many reasons that we may not enter in that. So more skills or more experience. Well, I say maybe same skills, but more experience. So when a company is hiring someone, of course, experience is very needed. So what we did, we put in place a system of internship. We discussed with USAID, and we put in place a kind of a network, what we call WIRE network, Women in Renewable Energy, in Rwandan Energy, sorry. And this network was providing financing to get interns in our companies, not only mine, but companies of people working in electricity, renewable energy, engineering. In fact, it's engineering ladies. And with that, we can take time to train ladies to get the same level of knowledge as the others. It's still a new sector, so ladies are not so many in the sector. And that's why it needs really a push to help them to get internship. And also there is a side of leadership learning also that we provide to them.
Thank you very much. So maybe moving to a question on the private sector, and I will target this question to Mike and also to Michael. So is there more the private sector can do by itself before turning to the donor community, or the donor help is always needed in this sector? I know it's a difficult question.
I think it's a really good question. It's something we struggle with, is how do we avoid providing subsidy to the private sector whilst making sure that the really difficult stuff gets done. I think one of the ways we've tried to do this is thinking more about the concept of additionality and how we record the results that we achieve. So by only focusing on the really difficult places, we tend to make sure that our investments have more impact. I think trying to incentivize the private sector into those type of areas is required. There's certain sectors such as adaptation where there's just no private investment, and as such the public sector has to kind of pave the way there a little bit and provide some support. I think increasingly in FCBO we're moving away from certain sectors like renewable energy generation, because we're beginning to see that the private sector is now more comfortable with the type of risk in that sector, less likely to require the kind of de-risking that the public sector can provide.
Thank you very much, Mike. So maybe Michael, do you have the same view?
Yeah, there are some private sector actors, I would argue, who don't really need our support. But it's sometimes hard to draw that line. One, because we find that even some of the actors that are considered to be relatively experienced still struggle to mobilize funding. And for some of them, again, with respect and appreciation, because it's as Francine says, people are trying to run a business, which is not necessarily the same as mobilizing finance. You know, so even there can be an added value for accelerating support. And that's my second argument, that look, we're facing a bit of a challenge here as far as the energy access targets and the climate targets is concerned. So it needs to be a bit faster. So I would like to argue that there is still a strong role across the board for catalytic funding that is, however, as additional as possible. And in terms of what private sector can do more, I see in our case, some of our setup, especially with the focus on a very specific type of competence, you know, is actually intentional, because we try not to interfere with the doing business of the company or do that work. That is not for us to do as donors. And in our case, we try to plug in specific value-adding expertise that can help the entrepreneur. The trouble is what Francine refers to. I have had this conversation with many entrepreneurs over the years. It is still hellishly complex, even if you get good advice to mobilize funding. And maybe we can do something on that side and make some of the funding simpler. The thing is, however, Francine, also some appreciation needs to be due to the financiers, because they're also not in the business of losing money, you know. So there is a minimum due diligence and complexity that can't be avoided. And that is somehow the space in which we're operating. What private sector can do, I mean, I would like to also argue that what we often see is a call for more money, make it simpler here or there. A good first step can be to first look at what actually is my strategy for growth and for obtaining funding, and how will I develop the business, and also obtaining that kind of advice. I know from a lot of financiers who are flooded with requests for funding that they cannot possibly process at this point and in that form. Yeah, so there's also a call here, if I can put it this way, to do more preparatory work prior to reaching out to financiers and understanding a bit better how this works. I understand it's complex and it can be frustrating. And I think one of the takeaways should be that there is a task here to simplify this, because we need to have a lot more private sector business development and also private financing, because public sector, however much I appreciate it, there's a catalytic role and certain things are better done by public sector probably too. It won't be enough. There is not enough money on the public side. We need private sector.
Okay, so maybe one follow-up question. Thank you very much. One follow-up question on that from the audience, and Mike has touched base a little bit on that, and you did as well. But what are the ethical challenges this time that you have encountered when assessing or deciding on which project to finance? I mean, beyond the preparation.
Okay, I'll go first on this one. I think we found a lot of safeguarding issues, firstly, just in terms of, you know, where and how project developers are operating, and specifically we've had a few instances of how they're interacting with the local community. And to tackle that, we've tried to embed capacity around knowledge of safeguarding and how you pay due regard to those type of issues. I think on a broader question, one of the real ethical challenges we've had, and we've had this specifically in the context of the DCED Capital Assistance Facility, is if you provide support to enterprises that are going to lessen the environmental impact of fairly unsustainable industries. So, for example, using biofuel from something that's fairly unsustainable, like palm oil. So do we want to help make an industry we fundamentally don't see as sustainable more robust in order to lessen its environmental impact, or do we think we should stay completely clear? And those type of ethical issues, I think, are difficult and ongoing, and we tend to judge them on a case-by-case basis, see how it goes, and then reflect that in our policy at a later date.
Thank you very much, Mike. Maybe a question to Francine, and you've already touched base in that, but if you had to prioritize 2 issues that still need to be done better by the donors and the implementing organization, what would be those? If you had to single out only 2.
Are you talking about the question is linked to the support or direct financing? That there is 2 different things. If it is in terms of support, for me, I would see a support, and then I take the example to Get.Invest, a support really in terms of long-term capacity, local capacity building, and nationalizing the support which are on ground. Okay, that's what I see. If it is in terms of financing, I think also delocalizing. Sorry to say that, but also it's far, and sometimes the context, and Michael mentioned that also before, the context might be different, and the question that you might ask might not be adapted to the local situation. So if possible, delocalizing, and also Michael mentioned that also to be more flexible, to pay more attention to the person, the developer, the project developers, instead of taking into account the rules, the bureaucracy, and the platform, and so on. So that's what I would say. Really to see what are the potential of people, even if they don't have all the financial tools and all the right answer that the financial language wants to hear. Please pay attention to the ideas that they have and help them to find a way to finance also the business plan and the financial, the feasibility studies.
Great, thank you very much, Francine. So maybe to carry on, one question came from the audience, and basically the audience wants to know what fund or grants are given for pilot study. So what we've been talking about, the early stage financing gap, and what parameters are checked for eligibility. Maybe Michael, you want to come in, since you know many project preparation, many donor programs.
Question is, what is a pilot? If it's a pilot that is proof of concept, where you're not quite sure yet whether this thing actually works, then I would put this in the research and development space. And then in the European Union, there's a big instrument for that, the Horizon 2020 program. There's also a dedicated facility now to support such kind of ventures on the African continent, I believe, latest that I've seen at least. So this kind of pilot, I would put it there. If it's the kind of pilot, for example, we are supporting a mini-grid developer, mini-grids as such don't need to be piloted technically anymore. But it may be necessary if you develop a portfolio of mini-grids, which was the case here, 20 mini-grids in one go, you still need to start with the first site to convince everybody that this thing actually is going to fly. And that kind of pilot, I would argue that this belongs as early stage. That is the first tranche of the actual investment capital, or could still be seen in the development phase of the project, which would make it eligible for development funding. And there are several financiers out there that ultimately will provide debt, but they have the ability to provide also funds in a development stage, which can then be turned into part of the debt later. Cut a long story short. For example, or that you get one of the equity facilities that is in the market to support. I don't want to give names right now to not be biased or advertise for anybody in particular, but they exist. Again, here, in our line of work, when where we sit is not R&D, it's not research and development. It's bringing things to the market and helping growth, and where something can go actually to scale. Our type of public funding, remember we're spending taxpayers' money as well, should be there where it can go to scale. Either in a few approaches that are very big in themselves, or hopefully by supporting Francine to grow as quickly as possible, and then many companies such as Francine.
Thank you very much, Michael. So to make it short, the answer would be to come and reach out to Get.Invest, and you will redirect them to the.
I didn't want to create the impression that we're the silver bullet. We're certainly not. Again, we're a specific tool for a specific problem. And maybe one last word about that, because there was a question, what about the other green sectors? I would like to argue that if you want to provide good advice, especially done remotely, especially in times of COVID, for example, you still need to understand what it is that you're advising on. And the complexity on energy topics in itself is already so big that while I appreciate that you might have other sectors where the problem is similar, I'm not sure I would be entirely confident to run a facility that promises to solve the same problem in all the green investment sectors. I would like to argue for specialized competence that understands what the sector fundamentals actually are, that really understands Francine's business as good as possible, so that the advice that is provided, or the finance for that matter, actually adds value and fits to that what is to be advised on or to be financed.
Very good. All clear. So maybe a question to Mike. We had a question from the audience saying that we know that the public sector simply cannot move fast due to the complexity. How we can circumnavigate this, particularly in the aftermath of COVID-19? So how maybe the public sector can move faster, how can it adapt, or maybe how we can support vehicles that can maybe afterward provide help in a faster way?
It's a really good question. I think we're experimenting with two different approaches to this. So one is trying to be more agile in our programming and how we provide support, and that means moving towards more things like challenge funds and innovation funds, where we provide smaller amounts of funding, but are a lot less directive around the kind of constraints on that. And then we try and pick up what works and give funding to that as quickly as possible. It's still difficult to do things like that, and it's, as an organisation, we're not that comfortable with that level of risk, so we're feeling our way. But I think it's beginning to have an impact, and we're supporting bigger funds like the Global Innovation Fund and the Global Innovation Lab to try and bring on more early stage ideas. I think the other thing we're trying to do here is try and establish a taxonomy around green investment and impact investment, so that everyone is kind of talking the same language and there's less sort of confusion and potentially greenwashing around what different people are trying to do, and basically trying to make sure everyone is speaking the same language, try and demystify some of the terms and try and make it a bit easier for people to engage with each other. So I think those are the two areas we're looking at the moment to try and be a bit more agile. We found, especially with CP3, I think it was like an oil tanker. Essentially, once we set direction, it took a very, very long time to kind of steer it to new and emerging areas. And we've embedded that learning as an organisation.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think we'll take another question from the audience, and it's a very good question. What about PPPs? Attracting green investments requires robust green project pipelines from the government side. How do you streamline public-private partnerships? That's a difficult one. Maybe one of you wants to go. Maybe Michael, you've talked a little bit about the enabling environment.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on the PPP?
PPP, having worked for many years on PPP, is actually an interesting term. The understandings of what it means, they can greatly differ. but I would argue that there are certain models, especially grid-connected electricity, as well as now we see also a lot of discussions on strong public sector preparatory role on mini-grids, on rural electrification. That's where this really comes in. And some of these models foresee, and I think that can be a very good idea if done right, a strong pre-structuring of all the financing components as well in the course of the preparation, so that then private sector applies for a comprehensive package. I think that is something that can actually work quite well, and again, without putting names, that's going on in several countries. But in others, you might still end up in a situation where the developer still wants access to the public sector-led promotion scheme, whether it's a tender or an auctioning or a concession scheme or something like that. Once that is granted, you still need to mobilize your funding, you know, and you still need to jump through a lot of those hoops out there. I would even like to argue it should be that way, because remember, in the end of the day, we're trying to leverage private funding into this. The estimates go, what I hear is that roughly in terms of the investment needs, only a fifth of it can be covered by public funding. So we need to get private capital in one way or another. And I can tell you one thing right now, there's very little private capital in sustainable energy in Africa. So there's something that needs to happen a lot more, and clever blending instruments can play an extremely important role here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So maybe I will turn to Francine. We have talked a lot about what international organizations can do, but what do you think government in Africa can potentially do better to enable people like you develop green projects?
I think I will take the example what they have been doing in Rwanda. First of all, they have enabled the private environment. They have eased the way to do business, to open the business, and to facilitate the work of private sector. And also in terms of green, in terms of climate finance, or climate change, sorry, they have put in place very ambitious targets to fight the climate change. And thanks to that, there are some organizations, I don't know all of them, but I know that there are some organizations who are tackling these challenges. We know that when we talk to the Rwandan Development Bank, they are interested in green investment. They have a fund linked to renewable energy and rural electrification. They put in place also, we have also an organization which is called Fonerwa, which is a green fund where people who has projects can go and submit their ideas to them. I say people, but it's institution and private sector. This fund is existing. There is also a special organization which is called REMA. It's an institution regarding renewable energy, who also has projects to encourage people doing or sensitizing them in climate change. So I think if people can, if organization, institutions, African institutions can also copy and adapt, because we don't say copy and paste. Copy and paste is never good, but copy and adapt the ideas that we have here in Rwanda, it would be nice.
Thank you very much, Francine. And maybe I will turn to Mike to ask you the same question. What do you think the local government could do more to expand green projects?
So I think one of the primary pieces of feedback we've had from companies we've worked with is that they require certainty, and that they require, you know, a clear blueprint around how they have to operate. And one of the things I think we have experience of is that the policy environment or regulatory environment in a country can change quite quickly, or that the local government can be seen to sometimes change the parameters of the operating environment quite quickly, and that type of uncertainty puts off investors and makes it quite hard for other companies to come in and follow a kind of template that's happened previously. So I think that kind of regulatory policy certainty and that signaling to the market is really, really important, just to give companies the confidence to come and invest. I think a lot of the good work we're seeing in terms of trying to bring the private sector in is from initiatives like the climate investment funds, where MDBs are working with local governments to create investment plans and to work on how to effectively bring in the private sector. And that type of collaboration, I think, is going to be really important going forward.
Thank you very much, Mike. Maybe I'll take one last question from the audience, because it's a question that has been coming quite often, and I think it's a bit of a difficult one. Do we have green standards? What do we mean by green? And we've heard a lot about greenwashing, green taxonomy. Maybe you guys can provide some insights on that.
I'd be happy to start
because
we have it so easy, you know, because we're promoting renewable energy and energy efficiency, which in most cases means that either, okay, in the most complex context, you would argue that there is a suppressed demand. Some of you might have heard this concept, where people would, even if they could afford it, or if they could afford it for the very poor, they would use kerosene or another very dirty polluting source. So one is replaced. I would argue, to answer your question, I would argue that the moment that you make something significantly less polluting and significantly more sustainable, that would be an important threshold. In the case of renewables, it's quite easy. In most of the cases, one could then look at, for example, in mini grids, sometimes it's a good idea still to have a diesel generator, because batteries can be still too expensive in some of the contexts. It's just what it is. And then, you know, it gets even more expensive for the end users. So you might end up having a fossil fuels component still in it. You know, and in our sense, this still is eligible, and this does make development sense, all things considered. There is a lively debate around LPG for cooking purposes. I would not discount it entirely, because sometimes it's also a question of the lesser evils of transition technologies. You know, forests being cut down and the implications of that in the countries on the ground are pretty disastrous. So I would still like to believe that in the energy space, clean energy space, we have it relatively easy.
If you allow me, Ghita, yes, I will give an example also of what we have been doing in Rwanda regarding green building. It's very difficult to find standards, so they put in place minimum standards. We have an association which is called Green Building Organization in Rwanda, and they have worked with what we call the Rwanda Housing Authority, and they put in place a minimum standard for green building. And this is in application now since few weeks. So if each country can also provide this kind of standard, we do that also for mini grid. Also, they put in place minimum standard for mini grid. So it gives guidelines to all of us to follow, to be able also to be on the same understanding, to have the same understanding, and to reach also the goals, the ambitious goals that we got in our country to reduce carbon emission and to fight climate change.
Perfect. Mike, do you want to come in?
Yeah, this is a topic that's quite close to my heart, because of CP3 we had 3 different components, and all 3 of them were reporting in slightly different ways against what were ostensibly the same measurements of impact. So we have found this a bit of an issue. In the UK, we set up the Impact Investing Institute, and one of the things they're trying to do is create a kind of drive standards around a common shared understanding of what impact means. That's slightly wider than green, but I think it's relevant to this conversation. And you've got groups now like the Gary who are trying to do something similar for adaptation, and just try and make sure, like I said previously, everyone is kind of talking the same language, they have the same kind of expectations, and that different projects are comparable in terms of the outputs they're going to have and the difference they're going to make. So I do think this is an important subject.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. And I think with that, we'll wrap up. Maybe just to summarize what have been said so far. First, it's important to define what is green. We all talk about green projects, but it's important to have a taxonomy. It's important to have, as Mike just said, an impact assessment and have like some harmonization across definition. There's a simplified way, local ways for which we can tag green. Francine has talked about minimum energy performance standards put in place in Rwanda, and we see that those in many other countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. We have talked about the course obstacle of getting finance, especially at the early stage development. It's an important stage, I would say, because if you don't get your project right, then you will not get the financiers. And if you don't talk, we've talked about like talking the language of the financiers. So maybe you have the idea, but you need to translate that to a language that the financier will understand. And the role of Get.Invest and other development facilities is really key there to unlock financing, much needed financing for this kind of projects, because financing exists, but it gets criterias. And of course, project developers has to have sufficient skin in the game. We've seen that it should one fifth should come from the government and donor program, and the other part should come from the private developers. So yeah, the project needs to be viable. We've talked about small projects are indeed very much needed. Big scale projects are important to reach the goals of that are set by government in terms of clean energy installed, but sometimes small projects are the only way to get electricity to Africa. We've talked about the off-grid sector, the mini-grid sector. Sometimes the grid is not stable enough to come and plug 100 megawatts. So it's important to come and develop these projects. And these projects are the most difficult to develop and are the ones that are facing the hurdles. And Michael said we need to be open. We need to listen to the ideas of the project developers. And Francine have highlighted the human element. It's really important to adapt to the culture, adapt to the local market. We've heard about donor facilities are important, the support is important, but it's need to adapt, it's need to come into the countries and understand the local context. So Francine will be visiting you in Rwanda shortly, maybe after this COVID crisis. And so with that, maybe I would like to wrap up. Maybe I will give the floor to Michael and Francine, maybe to share with us their last talk before thanking you all for joining us.
Thank you, Ghita. So I think, yeah, just in summary, one of the most important things we can do with the work we do in the sector is share the learnings that we're generating, so that when we find something that works, and just as importantly, when we find something that doesn't work, we share that with the rest of the donor community and make sure that we're getting the absolute most out of both our successes and our failures. So I think that would be my final thought on this seminar.
Thank you, Mike. Maybe Michael?
Yeah, and mine would be to sum up the key points, to keep it simple, to make sure that we actually add value with what we do, and to remain flexible in what we support, appreciate the diversity that is out there, and in which also the beauty of the opportunities in private sector lies. And maybe we can find a way how there can be more patience in the system while finding the right ways to accelerate things. But we still need to appreciate, unless we want to force something, and I don't think that will work, we need to let things grow. And some things also go wrong, but we need, okay, let me be specific. We need to give somebody like Francine the means and the time to actually develop the business and have the right types of support that are necessary when it's needed to develop and bring forward the business. And then I dare say we need to do that 1,000 times. So it's an interesting task that we have, isn't it?
Right. Thank you, Michael. Francine, one last
Yes.
word, maybe?
Yeah, just briefly, for me, what I'm expecting from this kind of talk and discussion of panel, it's a change. We know that change cannot come just in once, but I think we have discussed, we have give some ideas, Michael and myself, and for me, it's food for thought, and I'm ready also to discuss more with others, to share ideas and to build something which can make the life easier for others, for youngers who are looking for funds, who had good ideas. And let's not forget, this is also the economic development of our countries. It's job for people, creation of job. So really, I'm ready to help, to support, and for these big challenges. And we expect that from this meeting, from this panel, that we will get something new and additional. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francine. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for opening up this dialogue, if I understand correctly. So the audience will get the chance to reach out to you separately if they have follow-up questions. I'm very pleased that we could have all those fruitful discussion. And as Mike said, the most important thing is to share the knowledge. And I guess that our panelists have shared really frankly all their insights. So thank you to all, and thank you for the audience for joining us today. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.